You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Hahn,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is...
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have James Grippando back on the show with me today. We're talking about his brand new book, 20. And when you're hearing this, it's been out for a couple of days. I've had a chance to read the book. It is fantastic and a complete mind bender in all of the best ways. Welcome back to the show, James.
So glad to be here. Thank you.
James, what was it that got you interested in thrillers? Do you remember maybe the first one that you read that just, took you on a journey and made you want to tell stories like the kinds of stories that you tell?
Well, listeners may be sort of surprised to hear this answer, but the first book that I read that I would characterize as a thriller is actually Mutiny on the Bounty. And I can remember reading it at some maybe middle school. And I'd always loved to read. But I was so captivated by that book, by the adventure in it. But I was also very captivated by how tense and real the court-martial scenes were at the end of the book. A lot of people may not remember that from however many years ago they read that book, but much of the latter part of the book takes place in the English courts system when Captain Bligh makes good on his promise to see them all hang from the highest gallows. And those were such compelling, riveting scenes to me that it did sort of hook me. Not only I would call it sort of on my first thriller, but in some ways I think of it as my first legal thriller that I fell in love with, and it stuck with me. And it didn't, it didn't really hit me as a genre until some years later, in the 80s. Sort of two books came out that I would say really cemented my love affair with courtroom dramas and legal thrillers, and that would be Scott Turow's Presumed Innocent, and a book that became a very bad movie called Bonfire of the Vanities by Tom Wolfe.
Yes.
So and then, as luck would have it, right about the time those books came out, then along came this guy named John Grisham, who no one had ever heard of. But his books just caught fire, and there seemed to be this public appetite for all things legal and thrilling. And I don't even think up until that point in time anybody had even coined the phrase legal thriller. But of course, they are now part of the commercial mainstream.
Well, you mentioned Scott Turow, you mentioned John Grisham, and you, all three of you guys really kind of launched into the market around the same time, not at the same time, but around. You're all kind of part of this zeitgeist, if you will, of that became legal thrillers, like you mentioned. I've heard John Grisham talk about the realities of the law profession and how it's not all legal thrillers, air quotes here. And I have an aunt and an uncle who are both attorneys, and they laugh about what we read about the legal profession and the realities of it. What are some of the challenges of taking a profession that has a lot of downtime? That's, it's not storming into courtrooms every day and fighting for truth and justice, and and all this. But what are some of the challenges of taking any profession really and making it, thriller worthy? What are some of the challenges of taking the legal profession and making thrillers out of them?
I think the best way to answer that question is really this way. So I'm a trial lawyer, and I can tell you that if you're involved in the trial, it's thrilling. It really is, and especially for clients who have something at stake. Whether I've done criminal case, that's not my bread and butter, but even if it's just money at stake in a commercial litigation, it'll get your adrenaline pumping, and clients lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling over being deposed or having to testify in court, or having the anxiety of being cross-examined by opposing counsel. And so no matter how jaded we get as lawyers and think that this is mundane, or no matter how jaded we get as viewers watching TV show after TV show where this seems like the same old thing. I can tell you, when you walk into that courtroom and are faced with the process, it is anything but mundane. So I think my point is that I think it is inherently thrilling, and that is why it's important as a writer to make the reader feel like they're in it. That's really the only way to overcome what you've just described as sort of the mundane, the everyday common occurrence, the downtime, and so forth. There is an inherent drama in the legal process because it forces, especially in a courtroom setting, because there's a winner and there's a loser, right? And the fact that justice doesn't always win, I think, is dramatic, because you really don't. It's a human process filled, prone to error, and the consequences of that error are sometimes life and death.
Right. James, earlier this year when we talked about your protagonist, Jack Swyteck, and how this was his 25th anniversary recently. When you first started writing Jack, did you have any idea that he would have the sort of legs that this character has had?
Exactly the opposite, right? I mean, I thought I had, when he made his debut, it was September 1994 when the first Jack Swyteck novel came out. It was called The Pardon, which wasn't even my title. It's when you write your first novel, everybody wants to change everything about your book, including the title. So it came out as The Pardon, which ended up being a pretty great title because it really was a father-son story and about forgiveness. And that's why I thought I had wrapped it up very well at the end of the book, because I not only had resolved the plot in the story, which resolved around Jack, a young and ideological criminal defense lawyer who defended death row inmates, and his father, who was the governor of Florida and may have executed an innocent man who happened to be one of Jack's clients. So there was a great tension in the courtroom there, but there was also underlying that this great father-son tension. They obviously ideologically very different. And I thought I had wrapped that up really well in the context of the book. I put The Pardon behind me, and I ended up writing, so I think 5 or 6 novels after The Pardon that had nothing to do with Jack Swyteck. But then, if you go back in time, and I'm really dating myself here, but this this thing called email got really popular, right? So I was hearing, it was nice to get the old letters from readers, but you didn't get the volume of handwritten letters that you got in the volume of emails. And surprisingly, well, maybe not surprisingly, but people would read the pardon and discover Jack, who was 27 years old or something like that in the pardon. And they wanted to know more about him. And I kept getting these emails, and I talked about it with my editor, who ended up, Carolyn, and I did 24 books together, I think.
Wow.
So that was a milestone that ended, Jack's 25th anniversary was a milestone, but that was also the end of Carolyn and my editorial relationship. She moved on, but it was really in that discussion around 2000 that she and I thought, well, let's bring him back, and there's a lot of life here, right? Jack was 27 years old in the pardon, there's now 6, 7, 8 years. Let's see where he is. And so we wrote a book called Beyond Suspicion that came out in 2002. And it was great fun for both Carolyn and me to go back to Jack Swyteck. And fortunately, it was also well received. And the book did very, very well. And so we decided Jack was back, and I ended up doing, I think, 3 or 4 Swyteck novels in a row. And the rest is history, as they say. I'm hard. There are a few protagonists in legal thrillers who've been around longer than Jack, but I'm proud to say that he's 25 plus years is quite a nice run.
Well, he's become a mainstay in the genre, that's for sure. And with a character that has as much presence as he does, and has it. Well, let me ask it this way. When you're writing a character, a long-running character like Jack Swyteck, the quote-unquote world building has to be easier because when you come into a new scenario, all the players are in place, all the setting is there, and you get to kind of jump into the story. And that would be, I would think, one of the easier parts of having an established character with established backstory and all of that good stuff. But what are some of the challenges of writing a long-time character like Swyteck? We know the world building, quote unquote. That we think of that in science fiction and fantasy mostly, but it holds out for every genre. There's established backstory. But what are some of the challenges of having a character that you're familiar with?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because it is scary when there's 2 things I would point to right off the top of my head. And one of those is what made me nervous when Carolyn decided that to retire. So she really was sort of my check. She knew Jack's backstory as well, if not better than I did, right? So I had this backstop of Carolyn's institutional knowledge about Jack Swyteck, so that if I had Jack do something or that was that's my doggy. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So Carolyn was my backstop. She really did have that institutional knowledge to tell me you can't have Jack do this because that's inconsistent with what happened in this other novel or so forth. So she was great in that regard. The other thing that is tricky is repeating yourself, right? You can't keep telling the same stories about your character over and over again, because people who've read the series, they know it, and they're going to get bored with it. And one tip I give in writing seminars and so forth, if there's any aspiring writers out there, and I found this works really well, is that you actually can recover old ground, but it's more interesting if you put it from somebody else's point of view. And when I say that, I mean, I write in the third person, so that makes it easier, right?
Sure.
Jack's best friend, Theo, is sort of this, comic relief sidekick. He was, Jack's only client. Jack defended on death row, who was actually innocent, but he lives his life the way you would expect someone who spent 4 years on death row for a crime he didn't commit. He acts the way you'd expect him to. He lives for the moment, right? So he often has a different memory of these events in Jack's life than Jack does. Jack's abuela, Jack is half Hispanic, so he has his Cuban grandmother who is a very popular character. Well, she often has a different memory of exactly how this event or period in Jack's life went down. And so that having fun with that backstory that is critical to Jack's character, but becomes boring if for readers who've read every book in the series, it actually now becomes a plus, because it's kind of funny to see how Jack remembered things and how different someone else who's close in his life, their memory of those events might be. And so that challenge, I feel like I've turned into a positive, and readers seem to enjoy that. But you're right, that is a challenge, with a serial character. How do you keep it fresh? I think that's really the question that you ask, and the question that I ask myself every time I decide the next novel is going to be a Jack Swyteck novel.
One of the challenges, and this touches on that discussion and the discussion earlier about how do you make a profession that sometimes can be very mundane into exciting. Is that Jack Swyteck does have a personal life. There's more to him than when he's in the courtroom, and you really bring out a lot of that drama in the new book 20, because the scenario that kind of kicks off the book affects Jack ultimately professionally, but hits home personally as well. How did you come up with the idea for this book? And you've never shied away from tackling topics that are timely and maybe something that we're all thinking about on one level or another. And the topic of 20 is no doubt any less controversial, or maybe not even controversial, but hits us close to home. Talk a little bit about finding those topics and how the way Swyteck affecting him personally as opposed to also affecting him professionally.
Yeah. So Jack is now it's 20 plus years into the series. Jack's married now. He's married to an FBI agent, Andie Henning. They have a daughter who's kindergarten age. So obviously the things that are important to Jack now in his life, he no longer really does death penalty work. He's a sole practitioner. So the things that are important to him now are very different from the things that were important to him in the pardon, when he was just this, sort of rebellious, ideological lawyer defending death row inmates in his 20s. so that was first step. It's like decide, well, what's important to Jack, and it's really is a great relationship with his daughter, and she's becoming, anybody who has a kindergartner will attest to that. I mean, it's just such a precious age, and there's such an innocence about the kids, but also just such a curiosity and sometimes a mischievousness that just makes them the total package that they are. So I wanted it to be a book about, if not about that relationship, at least about something that was very, very important to that relationship. And so I started going through well, where are we going to start with this? And of course, with any thriller writer will tell you is that when you're noodling around for a new idea, you kind of play the so-called, what if game, right?
Yeah.
What if this happened, or what if that happened? And because I live in South Florida, one of the biggest what ifs that parents don't really talk a lot about, but are especially worried about, are keeping our kids safe at school.
Sure.
Right. So when I was 19 years old, my parents moved to Coral Springs, Florida. My mother, who's 93, still lives in Coral Springs, Florida. Well, Coral Springs police were the first to respond to the Parkland shooting at Marjorie Stoneham Douglas High School, in which 17 high school students were killed on Valentine's Day in 2018. So yeah, that hit close to home to think that's because Coral Springs was such a sleepy bedroom community, and people moved there to raise their families and to raise them safely and send them to good schools. And this event happened. So it took me a while, though, to decide I was going to write a book centered on that, because I know it's a heavy topic. And then, as usual, when deciding on what to write about, it's never just, I shouldn't say never, but rarely is it sort of one thing that steers you in the direction of your next novel. There are other things. And it occurred to me that, okay, 20 is going to come out. And this was 6-8 months ago, before I really started writing, and I realized, well, this is going to be 2021 when this book comes out, and I was aware of the fact that this would be the 20th anniversary of the attacks on that occurred on September 11, 2001. And then, of course, things are often running from there. I have this sort of confluence of school shootings, safety at schools, 20th anniversary, and of course, and I don't mean this to be glib or at all, but it seems like there is always a Florida connection to the world's biggest events / tragedies, / newsworthy events, and people may have forgotten, but the 9/11 hijackers all got their training
Right.
in South Florida, so there was a Florida connection there, and so that's really where things started to gel for me. Is that okay? There's these two main components that I have to deal with, and I do outline the story quite a lot. So, and this outline took quite a long time to get to understand how these two major events were going to collide, and they do collide in 20.
And in Jack Swyteck fashion, it plays out in the courtroom. And there's some interesting twists that happen in this book. And like I've come to expect, when you read the synopsis and you think, oh, I know how this story is going to go, it absolutely does not go how you think it's going to go. You talked about working on the outline for quite a while. When you're looking for those twists and points of misdirection, or maybe misdirection is not the right word, but the ways to take the reader down a path that they're not expecting. Can you talk a little bit about your process of discovering those things that you're going to pull the rug out from under the reader, so to speak?
Sure. Yeah. And a lot of it has to do with research, right? And I do all my own research, and I enjoy the research part of it. Often, so that's the starting point, right? Is that I do have a back. My first job out of law school, I worked for a federal court of appeals judge in Atlanta, which covered Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. And at the time I had that job, Florida and Georgia were executing more death row inmates than any other states in the union, including Texas. So I did have that backdrop and experience in last minute appeals, which we seem to be getting on a weekly basis when I worked for the court. And I can always remember sort of going home at night and thinking, well, I'm glad it's the judge's decision and not my decision on this, because you would get this, boxes and buzzes before, everything was electronic. You'd physically get boxes and boxes of materials at 7:00 at night, and the execution was scheduled for 7:00 in the morning. And, you're supposed to make a decision on whether the execution should be stayed or not. And we would work furiously through the night and leave it to the judge to decide. So I had some background in death penalty work that informed, Jack's take on this. But I also knew, I'm also the father of 3 children, and so I knew that readers were not going to be sympathetic to the idea of defending an accused school shooter. So that was, sort of the biggest challenge I had in writing the book, is figuring out, okay, how am I going to what twist is there going to be in this book, to make that acceptable? And I'm definitely not giving any away about this, because it really was interesting to me, because the first sort of twist in the book is rooted in actual fact. And that is that one of the fathers of a victim of the Parkland shooting wrote an op-ed for the local paper in which he encouraged the prosecution to cut a deal with the shooter, because he did not want, and that wasn't because he was against the death penalty. He wasn't against the death penalty, but from his own personal standpoint, he wanted it to be over, and he wanted 17 years, 17 consecutive sentences of life in prison without parole over and done with, rather than 10 years of appeals and process going up and down from the courts as to whether the shooter should be executed or not. And so I worked that into the story, and that's I tell that background because that's an instance of research in real life informing the twist as part of the process. and that works. It really does, because Jack does not want to take this case, and in fact, Jack is dead set against taking this case. But it is a father of a victim who talks him into taking it for that reason. It needs to end. The community needs to heal. And so Jack sets out on this mission not to set a school shooter free to walk on the street, but to spend the rest of his life in jail for the crime he committed, rather than reopening the wound every 18 months or 2 years every time the appeal from the death sentence comes up. So the other way I think you really develop the twists are simply what are the possibilities, right? And I always do that. I have my list. Oftentimes, the greatest red herrings in the book are original endings to the book, right? That's where that's where I had thought the book was going, but it turns out that isn't where the book was going. So it becomes just this really fun twist for the reader, and that happens more and more now than it did very, very early on in my career, because I used to outline all the way, as a matter of process. I would outline all the way to the epilogue, right? Now, and for the past 15 years at least, I would say that I outline to the point of conflict in the story, where good meets evil, and then I let the conflict be resolved in the writing. And, so, and what I mean by that is basically, if you've done your job as a writer, by the time, good clashes with evil and you have the big conflict in the story and the confrontation, all the elements are there for a satisfying resolution and conclusion. And if it's not there, then there's something wrong with the foundation, not the ending. And I started to find that when I got to that point of conflict in the story, if I started to write to a specific ending, it felt contrived. So now I outline to that point of conflict and let it work itself out in the writing. And sometimes it's fun. I surprise myself.
Well, James, speaking of art imitating life, 2020 has been full of crazy surprises this year. Do you think we're going to have a glut of thrillers next year, about COVID or some sort of global pandemic?
Okay, I hope not.
Me too.
But I hate to say that, because, probably it could very well be that one of my very close friends is actually writing one. But, and God bless them if they can make it fresh and entertaining and right. Exciting. I would not want to go there. It's sometimes, just because something happens in the news doesn't necessarily mean that it makes a great novel. And honestly, I found that I think, with The Big Lie, which was a political thriller. And I wrote that book kicking and screaming to the editor saying, what, I think, there's people who are getting enough politics, and they're like, oh, no, we've got to go there. And I would say that, some people agreed with my publisher and thought, oh, what a terrific, but others, and I totally understand this viewpoint, felt like, I really read to escape, and I don't really want to, be watching the news about an election and also be reading a novel about the election. So, there's two sides to it. I understand, but I think people will going to feel the same way maybe even more so about the pandemic. I'm not sure who's going to want to read about the pandemic. I mean, for example, right now I don't see people rushing out to bookstores to buy books about the 1918 flu.
Right.
It's like, oh, gee, can't get enough of that, that pandemic stuff.
Right.
I'm living. So,
right. Maybe there will be a time where it's not so close to the bone and we can explore, all the ins and outs of it. But hopefully it's not next year.
I'm with you. I'm with you.
Well, the new book is called 20, a fantastic Jack Swyteck novel. If you want to be entertained and on the edge of your seat, tackling issues that are current yet not, and still allow us to escape what's going on today, 20 is the book for you. We're going to put links to it in the show notes where you can get it in Kindle edition or audiobook or hardcover, however you like to purchase books. James, where can people find you if they want to dig into all of the great stuff that you're doing?
So I'm on Facebook, and I love hearing from readers on my Facebook account. And also they can just email me through my website, james@jamesgrippando.com.
Excellent. We'll put links to all those in the show notes to make it easy for people to find you. James, always a pleasure to catch up and to chat books. And we're going to send everyone to pick up their copy of 20. Thank you so much for taking time to come back on the show.
Been my pleasure. Thanks very much.
Both Barrels Publishing is the brainchild of successful indie author James P. Sumner. He has self-published over 15 titles in the last 5 years and has over 800,000 downloads so far in his career, meaning he has a wealth of knowledge and experience to share with the indie publishing community. Knowing the struggles of the modern-day indie author as well as he does, he wanted to create a platform that would allow writers of any level to learn the ropes, navigate the pitfalls, and produce a professional novel without wasting time or money in the process. Both Barrels Publishing is the perfect one-stop shop for any indie author, combining James's expertise with his own team of editors and designers so you can help your novel realize its full potential and learn how to publish yourself. The purpose of Both Barrels Publishing is to help indie authors get their novels ready for publication without all the stress, hassle, and unnecessary expense. We want to make your lives easier, which is why we're giving you access to a top-notch team to publish your novels, along with a generous discount on their services. You can also work one-on-one with James to learn the intricacies of self-publishing. No hidden cost, no false promises. We simply want you to publish the best version of your novel. BothBarrelsPublishing.com.